Hello, everyone, and welcome to ISDM Knowledge Series. Today, we have Mr. Salil Shetty with us, who is a human rights activist on poverty and justice. He played a key role in setting up the global advocacy campaign for the achievement of the Millennium Development Goals. And in recognition of his long-term commitment to human rights and a deep understanding of the complexities of human rights issues, he was appointed a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Carr Center for Human Rights for the academic year 2018 and 2019. He's also served Amnesty International as the organization's 8th Secretary General from 2010 to 2018. And before joining Amnesty, he was director of United Nations Millennium Campaign from 2003 to 2010. So he's going to speak about SDGs today and what does it mean for India's poor. We'll have close to 20 minutes of talking from Salil today. It'll be more of an interactive session, and then we'll open for Q&A to make it as much interactive as possible. So over to you, Salil.
Thank you, Paribasha. Thank you very much. And thank you to all our friends who've joined us from different parts of the country, if not the world. Delighted to join you and delighted to be part of ISDM's webinar series. I don't really know exactly who's on the line, so I'm assuming that most of the people who have signed on and who've joined us have a basic idea of what the Sustainable Development Goals are. So I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I do want to talk about, what's different about the Sustainable Development Goals. Most of you would be aware that in the year 2000, sort of in the turn of the century, was when the Millennium Development Goals were agreed. And this was with a lot of fanfare at the time in the Millennium Summit. And it was probably the first time that we had 189 governments sign on to what was kind of seen as a compact of nations on how to solve the most pressing problems of humanity. How do you end poverty, illiteracy, and disease? So that led to the 7 Millennium Development Goals being formed, and it was a landmark summit, a landmark achievement led by Kofi Annan at the time. I had the privilege of working with him for 7 years on implementing the agenda for the Millennium Development Goals, and I my own assessment, what we achieved from 2000 to 2015, which was the period of the Millennium Development Goals, was actually much more than I expected. It was a pleasant surprise at the end of 2015 to see how much had been achieved. Of course, it's also a question of how you want to see a glass half full or half empty. But so there were many gaps at the end of the 15 years, and also there were several countries which still hadn't achieved much, and so there were issues which we can come to. But but fundamentally, the 3 or 4 big limitations of the Millennium Development Goals were essentially what the Sustainable Development Goals are trying to address. And of course, having had 15 years of experience of implementing the MDGs, as they were called, had led to some adaptation and evolution in the thinking. So the SDGs are meant to have incorporated some of the limitations of the MDGs. So as you know, the SDGs run from 2015 to 2030. So it's also called as Agenda 2030. It's got a lot more complicated than the Millennium Development Goals. We now have 17 goals, a lot more targets, and even many more indicators. So I must say I used to struggle to remember all the goals and targets and indicators with the Millennium Development Goals, even when I was myself working on it. So for Sustainable Development Goals, don't even bother trying to remember them. There are far too many. But going back to the issues of what's different. So I think one of the big criticisms of the Millennium Development Goals were that they were not universal in their approach, which means that essentially for the G77 in the southern countries, they did feel that this sounded like, finger wagging about what's wrong with the global south, with the developing countries, and that the rich countries really didn't have much to do with these goals and these targets and indicators. So the SDGs have gone out of the way to try and make the agenda more universalist, which means that the accountabilities and responsibilities spelled out in the SDGs are as relevant to the rich countries as they are to the poorer ones. Obviously, a big evolution in the last 15 years has been the emergence of the climate agenda and a real feeling that, this is a crisis, a climate crisis the world is facing. So the Rio agenda, which, as many of you know, the Rio agenda is now incorporated into the SDGs, so it's kind of bringing together the poverty, social sector, and the climate agenda, which is partly why it's become much more complex and bigger. But another big gap or big criticism of the MDGs were that they were very focused on a kind of a socialist agenda of redistribution and welfare, and they didn't have enough on economic growth and how do you increase the size of the pie rather than how do you distribute the pie. So there's more on economy and growth in the MDGs than there were in the SDGs than there were in the MDGs. And the final distinction, see, all these things, it depends on who's viewing it. I'm talking about the distinctions from my perspective. I would say there's a very big, the other big distinction, which is really what I want to dwell on in the rest of the talk, is that the MDGs paid a lip service to the underlying causes of why development did not happen and why development didn't reach the poorest and the most excluded groups. So the whole issue of governance and rights, it's not that they were not in the MDGs, but they were weak. So that's got much more primacy of place in the SDGs. That's in terms of content. I will also say that in terms of process, the MDGs didn't have a very participatory process of developing them. The Sustainable Development Goals did go through a more open process. There was a lot of community citizen consultation. And I think the goals are richer for that. So that's, I want to just start by laying out some of the distinctions and why it's different and why these are so important for the coming 15 years. I should also say that on the implementation side, because as you know, goals are goals. These commitments made by governments are all fine, but governments come to the United Nations in New York every year and sign all sorts of things. After some time, we used to have a joke when I was at the UN that there was one government who came to sign on the Children's Convention, and when we kind of looked up the register, we found that the government had previously signed it. This is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. I don't know how true this is, but it's just an example of showing that you have governments who sign things, they don't even know they've signed it, so let alone implementing it. So having said that, on the implementation side, one thing that became very clear by the time we finished 15 years of implementing the Millennium Development Goals is that at the end of the day, there was still about a third of the population in many countries who were left behind. And that realization is linked to the governance and rights discussion I mentioned earlier. But the strapline, which goes with the Sustainable Development Goals, is a very, very important strapline. It's a strapline which says that, leave no one behind. Now, on the one hand, leave no one behind is kind of a sexy slogan, which we can just ignore and move on. But if you take it more seriously, that becomes a game changer. So how does that translate into the goals? So let me just highlight a few goals, which to me make the SDGs, and leave no one behind, a fairly revolutionary agenda, if it's taken seriously. Now, I'll come to this later. I don't think anybody takes these things seriously, but if it was taken seriously, it is fundamentally different to anything that the UN has attempted before. So take goal 5. If you look at goal 5 and basically any of the goals which are touching on structural changes and structural inequalities are game changers. So goal 5 is about gender inequality and making gender equality a reality. Now, in most societies, if you want to bring about gender equality in a serious way, that's essentially calling for a revolution, as far as I'm concerned. You take the 8th goal about decent work. Now, if you want organized sector employment, which is essentially what decent work is about, to offer fair wages, and decent work, in most developing countries, that will be a very big challenge. And then you'll take the goal number 10, which is now much more directly going into the question of reducing inequality. I mean, if you're going to reduce inequality, some people are not going to be very happy because, that is meaning that some people who are, such a concentration of capital and resources in the hands of so few. And Oxfam's done phenomenal work on this question of, rising inequality in the world, as is the World Bank. So if you want to reduce inequality, or the World Bank calls it inequity, they're too scared to call it inequality. But if you talk about reducing inequality, that's a structural change. Then goal 12 is revolutionary for the rich countries, so which is reducing consumption. I mean, is there any rich country person who's actually ready to reduce their consumption? Not that I'm aware of. And this is not just about the rich countries, but the rich people in poor countries, as you probably know, have consumption levels which are equal, which by the way includes me, has consumption levels which are equivalent to the rich people in the rich countries, or even the middle class people in the rich countries. So, but how many of us are ready to reduce consumption? We might go to a seminar to talk about reducing consumption. That if you say that, you are not going to be able to use aircrafts or, cars, etc., that's a fundamental lifestyle change, which very few people are ready to do. And then goal 16, which is the most revolutionary goal, which is really what I work on, which is about peace, justice, and strengthening institutions. And the operative word there, the most important word, is justice, because you can't really have peace without justice anyway. You can't have sustainable peace without justice. So peace and justice and rule of law and institutions are essentially about human rights. And as you know, most countries in the world, and increasingly so, have less and less respect for human rights. So I just want to paint the picture at the global level first, saying that the SDG agenda is fairly revolutionary agenda if we are serious about making any of these things happen on the ground. So let's shift now to going to the ground, and I wanted to focus my talk on India because obviously, if you look at all the statistics globally, if India is not able to achieve the goals, then the goals are not going to be achieved. I mean, India is such a big load in the world's poverty, world's on any of the indices and any of the goals and targets. If India's needle doesn't move, the world's needle doesn't move. So anybody interested in the SDGs would have to be very interested in knowing what will happen in India. Now, as it happens, I'm having this conversation with you from just outside Jhansi in Uttar Pradesh, where I'm actually spending time in some of the constituencies, parliamentary constituencies in UP and Madhya Pradesh, because I'm quite involved in the election campaign right now. No, nothing to do with political parties, but I'm very interested in the election process. So, and so I've been asking, out of curiosity, asking people who I'm seeing here if they've heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. I mean, not just random people on the street or in the villages, but even the government authorities, and nobody has even the faintest clue as to what this animal is. And in theory, in India, the SDGs are supposed to be implemented by the Niti Udyog as kind of the focal point. I'm sure there are people on this webinar who are following India government implementation more than me, and I'm happy to be corrected. I'm just telling you what I know from the headlines. But essentially, when I spoke to the authorities here, they said, no, we don't know what it is, but how does it matter? Because we're doing it anyway. When you ask them, when you tell them it's about health, education, water, it's all fine, we're doing it. So what's your problem if I don't know what the SDGs are? Because I'm implementing it anyway. But that's like stretching it a bit, because if you're implementing something without even knowing what you're implementing, it's a bit circular. But in as you probably know, that the mechanism to review the Sustainable Development Goals is also slightly different from what we had for the MDGs. So there's an annual sort of peer review mechanism, voluntary peer review mechanism. It's kind of inspired by the APRM from NEPAD in Africa, and also the Universal Periodic Review and the Human Rights Council. So, which essentially means that any country who's ready to put up their report card before their peer governments are invited to do so in the middle of every, I think in July or so, it happens, the review process. Now, in 2017, the government of India actually presented its voluntary review. And for those of you who've seen it, essentially it's a a laundry list of all the programs that this government is implementing. So you think of a program and it shows up in their report saying they've implemented it. And this, I think, is fundamentally problematic. It makes it sound like the SDGs is essentially business as usual. And as I was trying to make the point in my introduction, I think if you want to take the SDGs seriously, it is fundamentally different from anything that's happened before. Now, so it doesn't take very long before we start talking about the SDGs in the context of India's social, political, cultural context. You get to that in 30 seconds, really. So if we say leave no one behind in India, what does that really mean? So, I mean, it doesn't need sort of Einstein to tell you that if you say leave no one behind in India, it means essentially that you have to stop discrimination against Dalits, Adivasis, minorities, backward castes, and women, and persons with disability, children, and maybe the aged or the older people. So, and if you start going into each of these questions, so for example, if you want to address the question of discrimination against Dalits, that means you're questioning the caste system. How many of us are ready to do that, really? I mean, it's fine. You might be in a coffee house and question it. But at the end of the day, that's the fundamental basis of the Hindu religion. You can't, even Gandhi hesitated to criticize the caste system, which is the main battle between him and Ambedkar. Minority bashing is our favorite pastime right now. So inclusion in India means taking Hindutva head on. And that's not going to be possible, certainly before this election. And who knows, maybe even after this election. Women, I mean, if you're going to question patriarchy in India, you're questioning Manusmriti, you're questioning male, domination and power. But that's going to cause revolution inside every household, if you ask me. So I wanted to make the point that, and the other thing that we have to remember is that, if you look at the SDG framework, in many ways, what the SDGs are offering you is a list of economic, social, and cultural rights of the citizens of the country. Now, it is kind of a, human rights 101, and which is why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights brought together economic, social, cultural rights and civil political rights as two sides of the same coin. So we always say that they're interdependent and indivisible. Now, what is the state of human rights in this country, civil and political rights in this country for the last 5 years? It's just shocking. I mean, the atrocities on Dalits and Adivasis has gone up 6 to 8 times. The media is under attack. The judiciary is under attack. So, the point I want to make is that if you're serious about implementing the Sustainable Development Goals in this country within the framework of leave no one behind, we are facing a very, very challenging kind of context and reality, which I think is going to shake the very foundations of the way we do business. Don't forget that even if you leave alone what's happened in the last 5 years, a kind of frontal attack on human rights, civil political rights, on the Goal 16 issues, even if you leave that aside, as many of you know, the Human Development Index in this country, with our ranking in the Human Development Index in India, for the last 25 years has hardly moved. We are around 130. I've been out of the country for 25 years. We were about 135 or 134 when I left. We are now 130 or 131 or something like that now. So 25 years later, we've hardly moved even a millimeter. I'm not suggesting there's been no progress. Of course, we've seen reduction in poverty numbers, maternal mortality rates gone down. So there's much to celebrate. But overall, in the global ranking, we've hardly moved. On the other hand, when it comes to the number of billionaires in the world, we are racing ahead. We are now the fourth champion, number 4 in the race of the number of dollar billionaires that we've produced. So how are we expecting to address goal 10 of reducing inequality when we are hurtling in the opposite direction? Our Gini coefficient is getting worse and worse every year. We're the 12th most unequal country in the world. So I could say more, but and last 5 years, when we say leave no one behind, all we can see is leave no crony capitalists behind. So, which means if you're an Adani or an Ambani, then you have the entire field to yourself. So we are not in a stage where we are saying leave no one behind means don't leave the Dalits, Adivasis, minorities, backward castes, women behind. No, we actually push them even further behind. So my submission as I close my short presentation is that we have a massive task before us. Some of you may be aware that this Saturday we had a big rally which I was part of in Talkatora Stadium, and in that rally, essentially we put out to the political parties uh, for the upcoming election as to what is the people's agenda. And the agenda was drawn out by mainly the social movements, etc. So and I don't know if you can see this, but it looks something like this. It's called People's Agenda. It's online. You can look at it. But the reason I'm showing this to you is that if you open this and you look at the issue-wise demands which exist, and this is very linked to our discussion now. So, for example, if you look at the list of demands for Adivasi rights, so if you say leave no one behind, Adivasis are some of the worst affected people in this country. If you look at the list of demands and you see where we are and what fundamental changes needed in this country, if you want to put these, if you want to make the SDGs real for the Adivasis in India, you probably know what happened in the Supreme Court decision recently. But the Forest Rights Act, the issue of displacement, dispossession, the entire kind of destruction of the Gram Sabha and the Panchayat structure, PISA, Forest Rights Act, that's on Adivasi rights. If you look at the rights of the demands of the Dalits, the attack on Dalits, that we have to end manual scavenging, that we have to increase scholarships, we actually have to finally implement reservations, which we've never done seriously. And I could go on. If you take a list of demands on displacement, we've got a whole list on that. If you look at a list of demands on civil liberties, the kind of draconian laws we have, the Unlawful Atrocities Prevention Act, sedition, etc., etc. Or if you look finally at the list of women's demands for women, including reservation, including ending of violence against women. If we are going to leave no one behind in this country, we will have to implement the people's agenda. And my submission is that we are nowhere close to doing that. Interestingly, in closing, I want to mention that if any of you have seen the Congress manifesto, as you know, these party manifestos mean nothing. Nobody even remembers what these party manifestos say. It's almost as bad as these UN commitments. No one remembers them after they're signed. But I can't believe it's a coincidence, but throughout the Congress manifesto, they keep using the word of leaving no one behind. And they've used the 2030 date as well several times. So that's an interesting one. The other manifestos are silent on it. So yeah, watch the space. I think May 23rd we'll get the election results, and that might really determine to a large extent which way this country is taking and what will happen to the SDGs. So I'll stop there, Paribharsha.
Okay, thank you, Salil. This is quite an interesting perspective. We can give a few seconds to 1 minute to our participants, and they can post their questions. I want to read out one comment that has been posted already. And the person says the input on how less the government functionaries know about the SDG frameworks and targets resonates with me. I have worked with a couple of major nonprofits in the health sector, and the level of understanding they have regarding SDG is quite limited. So it's quite shocking how these nonprofits are not leveraging SDGs to guide their scale journeys. We have one question already from Shakib. He's asking, could you please share more about the people's agenda, the people engaged and the process? He's working currently as a country director for Christian Aid in Bangladesh.
Okay. Okay, Shakib, the People's Agenda is it's called Jan Sarokar in Hindi, and we launched it last week on Saturday in Calcutta Stadium. If you Google Jan Sarokar People's Agenda, you should get it. It was essentially the coming together of a lot of social movements. It was quite heavily anchored by MKSS, Mazdoor Kisan Sangathan Samiti, which is, I would say, kind of the people who helped to create the Right to Information Act in India, mainly coming from Rajasthan, but we had about 5,000 people in the audience, and all the major political parties, certainly the opposition ones, were represented. in the group. But I think if you want to actually see the document, it's there. So, but yeah, the process was that, for example, in India, the People's Health Movement has been working on health issues for a long time. So they put together the Charter for Health, the right to education, RTE campaigns, put together the education demands. So a lot of people have had long history of working on these issues. And so they compiled and as you probably know, for the election, we've had hundreds of different people's manifesto type things being created. So they tried to create a manifesto of manifestos for people, a mother of all people's manifestos.
Thank you, Salil. There's another question from Rajan, and he's asking, how can we develop local plan of action of SDG 2030 in Indian context?
Well, I mean, see, the one good thing about the MDGs and the SDGs, etc., is that, I mean, how can you develop it? I mean, it's like no one's stopping you, right? Because it's entirely up to you. Because the SDGs present, as the MDGs did, it presents a certain framework within which we can all collectively work, and it gives a certain legitimacy to whatever you're doing at the local level. Particularly at a time when civil society organizations are under attack, I think the SDGs do present a certain legitimate framework. But you should just go ahead and do it. If you Google it, there's a lot of material available online on participatory planning and local development, etc. The good thing is that the way the SDGs, just like the MDGs, were created, is not prescriptive. It doesn't tell you how to achieve the 2030 goals, because that is so contextual, and it's also, it almost takes you into a philosophical, ideological question as to how do you achieve goals. Now, it lays out the goals and it lays out the kind of end goal. It doesn't tell you how to get there, not really, in most cases. So I don't know if there might be UN friends on this call who might be able to illuminate us otherwise.
Okay. We have Mohit Jindal, is asking, governance and citizenship engagement now features as a sustainable development goal. Given how strong governance improves other areas such as sanitation, health, and education, why isn't governance in India a big problem to solve?
Why is it not a problem?
Why isn't governance in India a big problem to solve? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on how you define governance. I mean, my work at the Harvard Kennedy School is on inclusive governance. And I think that's the biggest challenge we have in this country, because it directly takes us into the question of inclusion and exclusion, because governance means inclusive governance, right? I mean, if there's 5 people sitting in the Prime Minister's office and deciding everything, and we call that governance, I mean, that's not by definition governance. Governance in a democratic country is that how do you take people with you? So there's this famous African proverb which you may have heard, that if you want to go fast, if you want to go fast, you go alone, and if you want to be effective in what you're doing, then you go together, right? So that's there's a big difference between just rushing into something on your own, and if you're going far and you want to achieve your goals, then you take people with you, and that's what inclusive governance is about. And we have a big problem of inclusive governance in this country, because we are a society which is so fragmented. So we have a lot of work to do. So I would say that, I don't know, maybe I might have misunderstood your question, but I would say that governance is a big challenge in this country. Even sanitation you mentioned, but I mean, I've just spent the last 3 days in villages in UP, and all of these, any program you do is very, very challenging on the ground, because Dalit Basti, which is separate, where the Dalits live is physically separate from where the upper caste live, and all the resources go into the upper caste section of the village. So, and particularly the Dalit women are the ones who are the worst end of, of being neglected and excluded.
Okay. Next question is related to MDG. So he says one of the criticisms on MDG was around the depth of indicators. It was more of a number, like the percent population attending school and not the quality of education. To what extent it has been addressed under SDGs?
So, I mean, I think that, all of these points had come up. My own view on the question of, quality and quantity. I mean, my initial work, first 10 years of work in development is all in education. And I was with ActionAid at the time, and we had endless discussions about Are we looking at quality or quantity? Now, obviously, it's a kind of a false debate, because if there are no kids in school, you can't improve the quality of education. So first you need to get the kids in school, then you need to improve the quality. So it's not an, I don't take it as an either or. But I also feel that numbers are important, because that way there's some metrics, you can measure it, you can see progress. But having said that, the goals are not meant to be uniform across every country in a sense, because your starting point is different. So they're normally expressed as percentages or ratios. So it factors in your baseline starting point. But on the quality of education side, there's been a lot more progress in the SDGs in terms of giving greater emphasis for the qualitative side of things.
Yeah. Okay. Vinay Kumar is asking a question.
I've lost you, Paribhasha.
And he says SDG in health services. At the higher level, they are aware, but are not sure how to go about it. It's like a fad word, and everyone is using it. With this kind of situation, how does one expect any development in his area?
Sorry, Paribhasha, I briefly lost you. Could you please summarize?
Yeah, I'll just repeat that question. So Vinay, who is a fellow at Vision India Foundation, is asking, he's currently working on SDG in healthcare policy.
Right.
It is many government officials at the lower levels of governance are not aware of SDGs, as we're speaking about. At the higher level, they're aware, but they're not sure how to go about it. It's like a fad word, and everyone is using it. So with this kind of situation, how can one expect any development in his area?
See, I since I was dealing with a lot of governments on implementation of MDGs, what I found is that if the governments were serious, what they did was they mainstreamed it into their planning system. So I guess in theory, Niti Aayog being involved is the same logic. But I know, for example, the MDGs, the Indonesia, for example, or Brazil, they actually made the MDGs their planning basis. So they really merged their national planning or state planning system with the MDG system. Now, in the case of India, India has never had a record of taking any UN decisions very seriously. It's not about some instruments like torture, which we have refused to add on the covenants, sign on to it, etc. But even ongoing development type commitments, we just sign it and then we keep it on the side. So that's what's happened this time. So the prime ministers would have gone and signed it, the heads of state signed it, and then the next level is told, okay, you signed it, kind of implement it. And then as it is, we're complex, we're half the responsibilities for education, health, water, etc. is all in the state list. It's not in the central list. So then from there to go down to the gram sabha village, we have a long way to go. But I would say that yeah, I mean, to some extent, I agree with the people who mentioned that it's not about SDGs, just knowing the word SDGs. It's a question of dealing with the substance of it. So I would say, you should really challenge them on the substance. And yeah, it'll be obviously very good from a global ranking point of view for us by 2030 to say that we've done well. That's the main benefit. We get a certain international comparative picture if we do well. But apart from that, I would focus on the substance of what the goals are trying to tell us.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Salil. There is another one, and he says, do you think the target set defined specifically in education sector is relevant in Indian context, where measuring learning outcomes is quite qualitative in nature? What are your thoughts on this?
See, I've not gone into that level of detail into the SDGs, but I mean, we know for sure that the ASER report, which has been coming out forever now, tells us that, much as we have all these kids going through the school system, there's a shocking number, a very high proportion who really are not able to read or write, let alone comprehend and do any kind of complex math. So I think tracking learning outcomes is obviously very important, because otherwise, like somebody said earlier, it's really the quality of education question, right? So if you say kids are in school, they've gone so many hours. Now we have a midday meal. In fact, in the village I was in just before I came into the room, all the kids are going there to get their midday meal, and hardly anybody stays after that. So So the numbers could look good. So I would say some, outcome proxy measure is important. I fully understand that, managing it in a large system to get accurate data is quite a challenge. But I would say as a metric, it's important. Maybe you do a sampling sort of way of tracking it.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think the next is more of a comment than a question, and it's from Rajan. Says CSOs can do a lot on SDGs, targets, and indicators to be achieved, but the space of platform seems quite curtailed, and networking is to be activated.
Yeah, I mean, civil society is under a lot of stress and strain, as we know, as are all other democratic rights. So, but I think, I mean, silence is not the option. It's otherwise, those who are silent become complicit at times like this. So I would say stand up and voice your opinion.
Yeah. And so the next question is also what I want to ask you. In terms of SDGs, are they realistically attainable given India's context?
Well, I mean, the context is our constitution. So, in a few days' time, we have the Ambedkar Jayanti is Ambedkar's birthday that's going to be celebrated. So, 1947 to 1950, let's say, when the constitution came into effect. Now, 69 years later, if we are still going to be describing our context as an excuse to not deliver our commitments, there has to be a limit to it. We can't keep beating women and saying, that's our context. No, I refuse that as a context. So, I mean, we better change this context if that's our context. We can't keep, attacking minorities and Dalits and women and say, what do we do? We've had 3,000 years, we've been beating women and Dalits. So that's our context. So, I mean, maybe that's not the question, but, I'm saying that we can't use, I mean, of course we have to, and that's also the exact same question with human rights when the discussion starts as to, is human rights a relative concept or is it an absolute concept? Now, obviously, at one level, it is relative. You can't do anything in India which just because it's happening in Sweden or what. I mean, obviously, we are at different stages. But having said that, there are some red lines. You can't say that everything is relative. No, I mean, you can't say, like female feticide. You can't say, we are a country with 3,000 years of abusing women, so let's accept female feticide. No, sorry. Then that way sati would have still been going on if he had just said that. So you have to draw the line and say, no, there's something which we're not going to take context as a reason. You use context to, that is a question which somebody asked earlier about how do you implement SDGs in the Indian context. So yeah, you contextualize it. Obviously you need to understand how to deal with it at the local level. But yeah, you can't kind of, I mean, you can't dilute the fundamental values and principles which are founded on human rights in the case of the sustainable development goals.
Yeah, thank you. And I completely agree with that and resonate with that. We have to move forward and we have to just visualize a better country, better nation where we are, seeing ourselves living happily. Shakib is asking another question and he says, what kind of a connect you see between SDGs and HDI? Is it true that countries smaller in size are doing better than the larger ones, like Bangladesh and Sri Lanka are doing better as compared to India?
Well, Bangladesh is not small. I mean, I suppose everything is small compared to India, but Bangladesh is huge. I mean, it's 200 million people. It's one of the largest countries in the world. You're just much more densely populated because of the physical constraint of land space. But no, I'm not so sure about that, Shakil, as to, I don't know. It's not like I've analyzed that question, but I don't think it's a size issue. Then, how do you account for China? You could say that China has achieved its goals sometimes with little respect for democratic rights. But then these days we seem to be in the same situation as well. So, but we are trampling democratic rights and not achieving our economic and social rights. So we are in the kind of worst case. We've had the worst of both worlds, it seems, in the recent years. So I don't think it's a size question. I mean, certainly location matters. If you're located in a place where you have good water connections, you've got good market connections, you've got a readily available market for your products, and naturally as a country you can do well. But don't forget that, our challenge in South Asia, which is not very different in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka also, is that, so India, for example, I didn't mention this earlier, we're 130 in the Human Development Index, but, we have our Prime Minister and everybody else thumping their chest and telling us that we are now the sixth largest and now we're the fourth largest GDP in the world. But, in the villages where farmers are committing suicide and I go and tell them we are the fourth largest GDP in the world, you're going to get beaten up by the farmers. So what do those numbers mean? So, when Bangladesh says, we've got like a massive increase in textile exports, garment exports, and it is true that, your GDP growth has been impressive. All of that is good, but that then comes to the question of what is the distribution of the growth and the benefits of growth. Now, I know that in the case of Bangladesh, social indicators have always been better than India, and we've always challenged the government of India, because how can a country which is poorer than us have better social indicators? There's no excuse. And maybe, because you've had such a long history of the big NGOs like BRAC and Proshika and Asha and all of them working, maybe that has made some difference, not just because they're delivering the services, but they've empowered your people much more to demand their rights. And at the local level, your panchayats are more accountable, I suspect. So, but no, I don't think it's a size issue, if that was your question. Now, relationship between HDI and SDGs, there's no direct relationship, but obviously the measurement indices are overlapping and intersecting. But, we had always refused to create a MDG index to compare countries, and there isn't an SDG index to compare countries. So we don't have a scoring or ranking system across the world, because countries are so different, you can't really rank them, they're not comparable. But HDI, Human Development Index, was very precisely created to compare and rank countries. As you know, Mehboob have created it with Amartya Sen and others, and it remained challenged for a long time, but now it's become part of the norms. I think people accept it. It's really a challenge to the old way of only looking at per capita income.
Okay. So I'll just move on to the next question. And it says SDGs are interconnected and their targets need to be realized simultaneously to meet the purpose. Do you think it is being looked at in that way currently in India? And are the interventions happening according to this understanding?
That's a very, very advanced dream. I think, we're in base zero of any of those questions. I think, post elections, there needs to be a serious discussion, and maybe ISDM can host it and get some of the, whoever the elected leaders to come and the concerned bureaucrats to really see, what does this really mean in practice? And interlinkages is one thing, but even if you look at them independently, are we anywhere close to achieving them? Do we have a game plan? And I suspect the answer is no to most questions.
Okay. And in terms of funding aspects, Salil, can you just throw some light in terms of how does this funding aspect play a role here? How do governments raise funds and prioritize funds?
So yeah, the MDG is one of the big kind of crowning successes of the MDGs was that aid levels significantly shot up. But the criticism of the MDGs was that it was too aid-centric, that was all about transfer of resources from rich to poor. The G77 and the developing countries felt that that's one of the big, remained a big gap, that they didn't transfer enough. That's an ongoing discussion. My own view is that, I always say this, that when our governments want to fund wars and when they want to, beat their own people up, etc., they seem to find money for that. But when it comes to development, they always say we need money from outside. So in any case, India has no excuse about lack of resources anymore. 25 years ago, that was a valid point. But these days, and most rich countries have stopped giving development aid to India anyway. So the only aid we get pretty much now are more infrastructural. So we have enough and more resources if we want to achieve the goals. The funding, of course, still goes to many low-income countries, particularly the African countries and the very small Latin American countries like Haiti and Nicaragua and Honduras. But yeah, for the Middle East and for most of the large Asian countries, it's not a resourcing question. It's not a foreign international resourcing question. It's certainly a resourcing question within our own budget. So, classically, again, if you look at the manifestos, the political manifestos of the new for the next elections, the Congress has committed itself to 6% of GDP for education, which, by the way, is exactly what the BJP had committed in its 2014 manifesto, and they never kept that promise. So I can't imagine the Congress keeping its promise if it comes to power. So, but we know, for example, that 6% of GDP is the minimum that you need to put in to have a decent education. 3% on health is, these are like minimum numbers we need to put in, but we are not doing it in India. We've not done it for decades. So yeah, so those are choices we make. We spend so much on defense. We don't spend it on social sector services.
Right, right. And if you were to talk about the global bodies, how do they have any idea to monitor the outcomes or targets of these SDGs? Is there
I mean,
any sort of benchmarking done?
So the one thing I should mention in terms of the funding question, I mean, the UN system is certainly pushing hard to also bring in the private sector into the financing of the SDGs. And to some extent that happened in the MDGs as well. My own view is that, I mean, if you take something like water, infrastructure is something else, but if you take something like water and social services, unfortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately, I should say that, India's always had a very high private provisioning of health and education, and it's only gone up in the recent years. And, one doesn't have to have an ideological view about private provisioning, in my view. But the question is, does that make it unaffordable for the poor? And what is the quality of the service at the point of provision? So I think if we are going down a privatization route, there's no evidence to show that private provisioning actually helps matters. In fact, most cases it doesn't. When I'm talking about health and education and water, but worst case, if you're going down that route, you need to have very tight regulation and monitoring of the provisioning through private providers. So that's on the one hand about financing, because mixed blended financing is kind of in fashion these days. The PPPs and public-private partnerships, and but it is an important conversation to have, I think, for those who are interested in the SDG financing models to take into account private sector or blended financing instruments. Now, coming to the benchmarking and tracking question, as I said earlier on, we do have an annual peer review. I'm pretty sure I'm not calling it the right word, but essentially, I think in July every year, they have a voluntary peer review process, right? And that was not there for the MDGs. It used to be once every 5 years at the summit. Now they've introduced this. What we did have for the MDGs was every country produced an annual progress report, which they would submit to the UN system, but there was no event to review it. Now we have an event to review it now, but you can imagine if 15, 20 countries present it every year, and there are almost 200 countries in the UN, then you're not even going to have all the countries being reviewed in 5 years. So if your question is there an oversight mechanism to track performance and hold governments accountable? I'd say it's very weak, because the UN system in a country, that too in a country like India, is beholden to the government. They will never have the courage to challenge the government because they'll be thrown out. May not be formally, but informally. So they have to, that's what's happening in the current disposition anyway, that they have to be fairly pliant and silent and not really challenge this government. But even when the Congress is in power, I've not seen many UN people stand up and speak out against the government's lack of performance, because the UN system likes to, because they hear the invitation of the government, they have to kind of do a dance of keeping them happy as well. So then what happens from the international side? So UNDP will have reports, and UNICEF and UNDP, who are the kind of two big agencies in the development space, do raise questions, but it has no, no teeth. I mean, so you could have a report and you could kind of, but on the other hand, civil society and independent actors can do a lot of naming and shaming, and they do that, and you get exposed if you, as a government, if you don't perform. But yeah, so my view is that number one, I think the accountability should be from governments to their own citizens. So I think it's very important that Indians or in South Asia, the people of the country actually ask the government what they've done in relation to their promises. Now, I was involved in setting up something called Vada Natudu Abhiyan, which was created for the MDGs. It sounds like a Bollywood song, but it's more than that. It's got about 1,000 organizations who track performance on the SDGs. So they're continuing to do that. We also, I think they're tracking about 100 spots of leave no one behind, 100 kind of physical locations. They're tracking what leave no one behind is meaning in the Indian context. So there's civil society organizations doing good stuff, and I think we can work with them.
Okay. So Vinay is asking your views on something, and I'll read it out to you. He says, Manrega, along with other similar social welfare schemes, are a hindrance to work. People have stopped going to fields to work, and the farmers are not able to fully utilize their land to gain more profits. Recently, on a visit to Nagaur town in Rajasthan, asked a Manrega worker why you won't go for work in agricultural fields. She said, why should I go? I get 110 days of work, health is taken care of by government, get ration, etc. Now, these schemes have both the farmers and laborers adversely. Your views on this?
Well, I mean, there could be exceptions, Vinay, but so I'm generally a supporter of providing labor, 100, 150 days as some of the manifestos are now offering to up it. I agree that there could be some distortionary effects in some places, but I think the problem in the last 5 years is that since this government doesn't think that Manrega is their program, they basically discouraged its implementation, and worse still, in the last few years, in fact last year particularly, they've massively not paid the workers. So there's back payments of many months which are there. So my own sense is, since there's so much of unemployment in the country and that numbers have only gone up in the recent past, that there is huge scope for providing employment, which of course then should be linked into creating some kind of local assets, for watershed management, for improved water management, land management. I know the implementation is problematic in some places, but fundamentally I'd be supportive of that idea. I totally agree that it's not a long-term solution, because obviously you can't. It is a kind of a subsidized system of disguised unemployment, if you wish. But considering that we are subsidizing the richest people in this country all the time, I don't have any problem in subsidizing the poor. As you know, we've subsidized Nirav Modi, we've subsidized Vijay Mallya, we are about to subsidize Naresh Goyal in Jet Airways. SBI is being pretty much arm twisted to pay for the mess caused in Jet Airways. So why should we, grudge this when it comes to the poorest people in the country?
That's very interesting. Shakib, there's one last question from Shakib, and he's saying this is regarding voluntary peer review. I was engaged in SFA, Sendai Framework, reporting in Bangladesh, and the larger challenge we faced is around seriousness, as people felt that the review is voluntary. Do you see similar issues with SDG? Can it not be made mandatory?
No, I totally agree. I think there's no teeth to hold the governments accountable. We talked about that a minute ago. But this is the problem with these UN processes, right? I mean, people come, it's voluntary. I mean, the goals are signed on voluntarily, so they're not going to agree to, mandatorily be to be monitored and held accountable for it. Now, having said that, like certainly in India, we have constitutional provisions for the fundamental rights and the directive policy. A lot of this has now been made constitutionally, like the right to food, for example, or the right to employment are now constitutional rights. So we can use that link to the SDG framework and actually hold governments accountable ourselves. The point you're making is, can the international community hold so-called sovereign national states accountable? That would be a nice place to be in. But as you know, the world has gone completely the wrong direction. We have, not just Modi, but we have Erdogan, we have Trump, we have Putin. We have had more and more of these muscular, sovereign male leaders who actually don't think they're accountable to anybody. And so, everybody, India is the greatest country in the world. America is the greatest. So we're all the greatest. We are the best because 5,000 years ago, we were flying planes. We had the internet. So we don't really care about anybody. So if you ask these kind of leaders to become accountable, try and tell Erdogan in Turkey or Orban in Hungary to become accountable, then you'll get a long lecture on sovereign states and how the UN can't force you to do anything. So I'd say we're a long way from that.
Yeah. There's one last question which has just come up, and I think this should be the last question. We have 3 more minutes for the webinar. So the person is asking, based on your experience, could you please suggest any of the developing country where the country's strategy or goals are aligned with the SDGs and showing some fruitful results? And was there any multiplier effect of aligning with the various goals at the country level? This may help us to learn the best practices from them and move from the base zero and make some progress.
So I'm not that familiar with the SDGs, because also, in my view, although they were signed in 2015, and as it happened, I was a civil society speaker at the SDG summit before the 180 heads of state. It's now 2019, and like most things in the UN, it takes 5 years for them to even start moving. So we are in that phase where nothing has really happened. So if you're asking me which developing country now has a fully aligned SDG strategy which is starting to show results, I can't answer that question with any degree of evidentiary basis, but I suspect that the answer would be none. But do talk to the UN in your country if it's Shakib, or I don't know if it is somebody from India asking the question. But having said that, I think that what we found last time was that there's all these golden boys and girls, right? I mean, so in Africa, for example, Rwanda is always Mr. Perfect. They always get everything right. They'll be fully aligned. They implement everything, and the aid donors love them. Ethiopia was another one which is always like that. Botswana was a third. So this country, I mean, it's not difficult to find countries. And I mentioned to you in the MDG context, Brazil and Indonesia, because it might be easier to find a very tiny country who's doing well, but Brazil and Indonesia are large countries which took it seriously and implemented it very seriously as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Salil. Do you have any closing comments or anything else for our participants?
I mean, I think it was great. I have no idea how many people were there, what their backgrounds are, etc. But having said that, I think it's great that we had this discussion. I think the most important thing for me is that all of you, to the extent that you're individual citizens or organizations who are not just from a government or UN framework, you can use the SDGs to initiate a public debate on the subject. You can hold governments accountable. It's a very important accountability tool. This is essentially what we did in the Millennium Campaign. We took the promises of the government, because normally when you ask governments why they're not done X or Y, they tell you, no, but we didn't say we're going to do it. But in this case, they've actually said they're going to do it. So we're saying, we're not asking them to do something new. We are saying, have you delivered what you promised? So I think it's a useful framework, and it's an international framework. So, there is a certain degree of naming and shaming power which international commitments have. So I would say use it to its hilt. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Salil, for your time and helping us understand different layers of how and what are SDGs. I'm sure the session was very useful for all our participants. And thank you everyone for joining us and participating so actively. Our next webinar is scheduled for 30th April, and we'll share more information about it soon. Thank you so much. Thanks. Bye.
Should I shut down by myself?
I'll just end the meeting.